Richardson to lead off our discussion with the title Racism, Fascism and the Far Right in Europe. How serious is the threat? So Brian will be talking and then we'll have some discussion before summing up.
Okay, thanks very much. Comrades, elections aren't the only, and for socialists they're definitely not the most significant arena of political struggle. Nevertheless, they are important, not least because they do represent a moment when there is, if you like, a concentrated focus on politics. It's the one moment every few years, isn't it, when ordinary people are told, not that politics really should be left to the experts, it's too complex and complicated for you. It's the one moment when we're allowed to exercise our supposed democratic mandate and vote in elections. So people discuss politics during election periods, and therefore they do, in that sense, represent some kind of expression of prevailing moods and trends. That having been said, it's quite clear that there is, and has been for some time, a mass disaffection, if you like, with mainstream politics, which has been reflecting itself in lower turnouts in elections. And there was a particular lack of enthusiasm for European elections. In the elections that were held in May of this year, the turnout across Europe was officially 42.5%. So a certain amount of care needs to be taken when suggesting that this is some reflection of what people are thinking. But with that important caveat, I think that there are some things that we can say about the European elections. And the first significant thing that I would say is that they do represent, in general terms, a worrying, deeply worrying shift to the political right. Perhaps most notably in France, Marine Le Pen's fascist National Front topped the poll with 24.85% of the votes. That won them 24 seats in the new European Parliament and is now the fourth biggest party in that parliament. That success was consolidated just last month in the Senate elections, where for the first time the Front National won 2 seats. And on current standings, Le Pen is would be well on course to make it through to the runoff in the presidential elections in 2017. In Hungary, the party Jobbik came second with 14.6% of the vote, winning 3 seats. Most alarmingly, I would say, in Greece, Golden Dawn won 19.4% of the votes, gaining 5 seats. And that's despite the fact that over the last year, the literally criminal and murderous activities of its members, including the murder of the radical rapper Pavlos Fyzas, have been exposed, and their members are being dragged through the courts as we speak. Despite that, Golden Dawn was able to recover from the setback of the exposure of those criminal activities and win those seats in the European Parliament. Elsewhere, various racist organisations, the Danish People's Party topped the poll with 26.6% in Sweden, the misnamed Swedish Democrats just under 10%, and of course here in Britain, UKIP topped the poll with 27.9% of the vote, winning 23 seats in the European Parliament. So I've described those developments as being alarming. Important, however, that we're not panicked into thinking that fascism is literally about to seize control of Europe. It is the case that we have seen fascists and other far-right parties make electoral gains in the relatively recent past without that happening. I remember, for example, back in 1995, the Front National made a significant breakthrough in France, winning control of 3 cities, Toulon, Orange and Marigny. 2 years after that, they also won control of a city called Vitrolles. 2002, some of you may remember that Marine Le Pen's father, predecessor as head of the Front National, Jean-Marie Le Pen, was able to defeat the socialist candidate Lionel Jospin in the presidential election and made it through to the runoff, which meant, of course, that French voters were left with the rather alarming choice of the crook, Jacques Chirac, or the fascist Le Pen. On that occasion, the alarm at the prospect of Le Pen meant that the crook Chirac got 82% of the vote in that runoff election. In Italy, I remember the supposedly post-fascist National Alliance, a successor organisation to the very fascist Italian social movement, formed part of the coalition government from 1994 to 2001, and its leader, Gianfranco Fini, was Deputy Prime Minister and indeed Minister for Foreign Affairs from 2001 to 2006. In Austria, Jörg Haider was governor of Carinthia, and his Freedom Party was part of the coalition government there from 2000. So in short, there have been various times over the last 20 plus years where far-right and indeed fascist organisations have made significant political gains. So we shouldn't think that what happened in May means that fascism is about to break through and take control of the continent. Despite that, however, as I indicated at the outset, what we've seen in May does mark a significant shift to the right and should set alarm bells ringing. What is the context within which those developments have taken place? I think that there are really two key points that I'd make in that respect. Firstly, since the attack upon the Twin Towers in 2001, there has been a sharp and continuing rise in Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism. It didn't start with the attack upon the Twin Towers, but has been deeply increased as a result of it. All the leaders of the major European countries, Angela Merkel, David Cameron, Nicolas Sarkozy, you name them, have made declarations which suggest that political Islam poses an immediate and grave threat to our national and international security, our way of life, our culture, and so on. For example, Cameron's first major speech on foreign policy in 2001 was a speech at a security conference in which he talked about the failure of state multiculturalism. 3 months before that, actually, in October 2010, Merkel had said almost exactly the same thing about Germany, how multiculturalism had, quote, utterly failed. In France, there have been systematic attacks upon Muslim communities, attempts to prevent mosques being built, banning of the veil, and so on. And even in a general sense, one of the arguments that is frequently used to say Turkey shouldn't be allowed to join the European Union is the argument that the European Union is a Christian union, and that Christian ethos would be threatened by allowing Turkey to join it. A huge, barely a day passes, does it? In fact, I don't think a day does pass when there isn't some new scare story about political Islam, radicalisation, threats, and so on. That atmosphere of Islamophobia fuels an atmosphere of deep hostility towards Muslim communities, demands for them to declare their patriotic allegiance to their country and to expose their family, their friends, and anyone who might be a threat of radicalisation. And I mean, clearly we have witnessed events like the attacks upon the Twin Towers, the murder of drummer Lee Rigby here in this country, and now, of course, over the last couple of months, the very rapid, sudden growth of ISIS in parts of the Middle East. But of course, we argue that far from this representing a medieval and intrinsically more backward phenomenon than other religions and cultures, so on, it is a phenomenon that has emerged from, and what we are witnessing is a blowback from imperialist competition and rivalries. And it's also critically important that we argue that these phenomena do not automatically reflect the views and opinions and attitudes of the overwhelming majority of Muslim people. So Islamophobia, a significant factor, I would argue, in the growth of racism across Europe. The second key issue, I think, which underpins the rise of racism has been the deep and intractable and continuing economic crisis that Joseph will have talked about in the previous session, a crisis that has utterly devastated people's lives, a slump that has gripped economies for year after year after year. Mass unemployment, collapse in public services, a destruction of people's hopes and aspirations for the future. In those circumstances, of course, far from accepting responsibility, the bosses, the bankers and the politicians turn to scapegoating in an attempt to deflect the criticism onto others, and consequently, therefore, concerns about immigration. It's not surprising that concerns about immigration feature very highly in people's considerations when they talk about the problems that we face across the continent. The need for such scapegoating means that, of course, in addition to the Islamophobia that I've talked about, other forms, older forms of racism have re-emerged, have been rejuvenated and so on. So, for example, in addition to Muslims being demonised, there are parts of Europe, this country, Sheffield, for example, where Roma communities are demonised and isolated. In Slovakia, literally having walls built to keep them excluded. A revival of anti-Semitism in some areas, and of course, it's the case that there is a constant barrage of hostility directed towards asylum seekers, people fleeing poverty, war, famine and so on in parts of Africa. I mean, there was a horrible photograph in the papers the other day that showed, was it a golf course or something? These people happily playing golf, you know, the posh and privileged, whilst people were literally hanging off fences trying to flee the poverty that they come from. So it's that general atmosphere, massive Islamophobia, anti-immigrant, anti-asylum seeker, racism and scapegoating and so on, that provides the atmosphere within which fascist and far-right parties are able to grow. What I'd argue is that there are a number of different forms and shapes that racism and fascism has taken. Some, such as Golden Dawn and Jobbik, are essentially straightforward, traditional fascist organisations based on the kind of forms that Mussolini and Hitler established in Italy and Germany in the 20s and 30s, attempting on the one hand to make electoral gains, and on the other hand having the paramilitary, the men in jackboots on the streets trying to intimidate, bully, harass and carry out violence, not just against immigrant communities but also against their political opponents, political parties, trade unions, workers' movements and so on. And I think, you know, as, if you like, the memory of the Second World War fades a bit further into the past, it's become that little bit easier for them to try and regenerate themselves. The second major trend is what has come to be known as Eurofascism. In essence, really, from you go back to the 1980s, 70s and 90s and so on, when that memory of the Second World War was fresher in people's minds. And clearly it would have been very difficult, incredibly difficult, for fascist organisations to just openly declare their allegiances. And it was therefore in that context that people like Jean-Marie Le Pen realised that they don't get me wrong, they absolutely held on to their core fascist beliefs, but they realised that to declare them openly would cause them some difficulties, and therefore instead they primarily focused, in their internal meetings when they were rallying their troops, the fascism was very much in evidence, but in terms of their public declarations, they would focus on a hard anti-immigrant message and a message against multiculturalism, but the fascism was kept very much under wraps. Occasionally, it would break out. They couldn't always control themselves. Le Pen, from time to time, would come out with his fascist declarations, such as when he described the Holocaust as a mere detail of history. But the collapse in support that he experienced was a reminder to him of the need to keep that very much under wraps. And it was in that context, through that strategy of Eurofascism, that Le Pen in particular was able to make the breakthrough that I described in the 1990s and 2000s. And it was that model of success, if you like, that was latched upon by the likes of the British National Party here in Britain and led them to their first breakthrough successes. Firstly, very limited basis in the early 1990s, but then later more spectacular breakthrough when they, in the recent past, of course, in 2009, when they won 2 seats in the European Parliament, Nick Griffin and Andrew Brons, and also dozens of seats in local elections and a seat on the London Assembly as well, based upon that Eurofascism strategy. The third major trend is what perhaps rather clumsily described as racist populism. Parties who are pretty hard right and racist, but particularly on issues of immigration and multiculturalism, but they don't have that, if you like, the paramilitary wing, the jackbooted thugs on the ground and so on. They operate almost exclusively in the electoral sphere. And it's within that, if you like, milieu that I would place UKIP. UKIP, undoubtedly an incredibly racist right-wing party that has really latched in the last couple of years with a consistent anti-immigrant, anti-multiculturalism message. Think of the way in which Farage opened his party's spring conference earlier this year, talking about that train journey that he made out of London, where he travelled station after station after station and didn't hear the English language being spoken. And he said, does that make me feel uncomfortable? Yes, it does. Even on the question of, when he's been asked about the economic impact of migration, being prepared at times to concede, yes, I'm prepared to accept that migrants might be hardworking, might make a positive contribution to the economy, but that isn't all that matters. They are changing the nature and the culture of our country, and that is a bad thing. Really focusing on that hard racist message. That is the milieu in which UKIP, I would say, places itself. A party, and absolutely a right-wing capitalist party. Farage himself, a public school educated merchant banker, funded by sections of British capitalism who have a particular project, a particular opposition to the European Union. But of course they know that they can't make the breakthrough that they want to make, the electoral breakthrough that they want to make, simply by relying on the votes of right-wing toffs and fox hunters and so on. They have to appeal to working class people, which is why Farage tries to project himself, doesn't he, as your best mate down the pub, who likes nothing more than a fag and a pint. The final one of the characterisation is, if you like, straightforward fascist street gangs, the likes of the English Defence League and so on. Now, I've described them as, if you like, 4 trends. It would be wrong, however, to say that they're distinct and completely separate from each other. They flow into, merge with each other, take advantage of the atmosphere created by each other, and so on, as well as competing with each other. So, for example, you take Farage very, very careful to distance UKIP from the BNP. Back in the mid-2000s, absolutely rejecting the proposal that the former tennis player Buster Mottram tried to broker a deal between the BNP and UKIP. Absolutely against that. Doesn't want anything to do with the BNP, but at the same time, only this week, in order to access funds from the European Union, being prepared to ally with some extremely rancid forces in the European Parliament. So let me say a little bit more. Having talked generally about Europe, let's look a little bit more at the state of play here in Britain. How long have I got?
Oh, sorry, I wasn't quite sure how long you were supposed to be speaking for. How long were you aiming at?
Give me
I'll give you 10 minutes, shall I?
10 minutes, go on.
Is that all right? Yeah.
In the the immediate aftermath of the European elections, a number of commentators were suggesting that the rest of Europe was becoming, that, you know, the way in which the votes in the European elections were fragmented suggested that Europeans were becoming more Eurosceptic like Britain. An alternative slant that was put on it was that Britain, through the spectacular rise of UKIP, was developing the European disease where racism is concerned. I think that if you look at that combination of election results, there's some truth in those assessments. But there are a number of very important caveats. The most important caveat, of course, is that here in Britain, we did buck the trend with the defeat of the British National Party. We set ourselves, if you like, shamed by the stain of the fascists getting in 2009, set ourselves a very specific goal of making sure that Bronze and Griffin were defeated, and that is precisely what happened, we can say with some pride, in May of this year. That not only is Griffin no longer an MEP, he's no longer leader of the BNP because it's precipitated a crisis within the organisation. I mean, he won, when they first won their council seat in 1993, Griffin argued then, we are now on an inexorable path to power, which will see me become Prime Minister. I mean, ludicrous suggestion, actually. But, compare that to 2009, a significant electoral breakthrough that they could, you would think, confidently think, is going to lead to significant gains. Instead, massive internal crisis within the BNP, Griffin out, no MEPs, and so on. And the reason that has happened is not simply through chance. It's happened for subjective reasons. It's happened precisely because we recognised that in desperate circumstances people can turn to far-right and fascist organisations. The objective, miserable economic conditions provide fertile ground for fascists and racist ideas to grow. But we recognised that it's not inevitable that they would grow, and that by building a united front, it's possible to stop them from growing. And we did so in very concrete terms. It's always worth quoting the poem by Pastor Niemoller because it captures the needs of the moment. When he said, first they came for the socialists and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I didn't speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I didn't speak out because I was not Jewish. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up for me. Recognising the need for unity amongst vast, numbers of people who have a real interest in stopping the fascists. Yeah. And precisely, that the strategy that Leon Trotsky, in desperate circumstances in the 30s and 40s, argued for people to put aside their political and other differences and to unite as trade unionists, workers' organisations, community organisations, and so on. And that is precisely what we believe, that the BNP could be defeated, not by ignoring them, not by trying to rely upon the state to ban them and so on, not as well by simply relying upon small squads of courageous, usually men, to take them on the streets, but by building a mass organisation brought together men, women, workers, community organisations, faith organisations, and so on. We recognise as well similar strategy needed to take on and defeat the EDL that began spectacular growth in the late 2000s and so on. it's important that we continue to build that kind of even though they're marginal, they're down, they're not out. We have to continue to build those kind of organisations for a number of reasons, partly to ensure that they're not able to grow and recover, but also we have an international responsibility. And in my last few minutes, I do want to talk to go back to the international situation, because I think it is clear that some of the lessons that we have learnt and applied here in Britain are being learnt and applied elsewhere across the continent as well. A fortnight ago, I was in Athens at a conference that was organised by a group called KIEFA, which stands for the United Movement Against Fascism and the Racist Threat, an organisation, therefore, dedicated and committed to uniting people against racism and fascism. And it was attended by people from across Europe, determined to stand up to the phenomena that we've seen in the last few years. Hundreds of people present, and every single person who spoke talked about how they are building an organisation in their country, whether it was Denmark, whether it was Catalonia, France, or wherever. In Greece itself, I mentioned Golden Dawn and the alarming rise of Golden Dawn. It's important to recognise that there, in the face of really vicious organisation, that Kiev has succeeded in bringing together trade unionists, workers' organisations, community groups, faith organisations, and so on. The conference was attended by the friends of Pavlas Fisas, the murdered rapper, by the mother of Shehzad Lukman, a young Pakistani who was murdered by fascists, and there was a very concrete discussion about what needs to be done. In France, it's important to recognize this is not a country that is completely enthralled to the far right. I remember going on demonstrations 20 years ago, huge demonstrations, 20 years ago, organised by groups like SOS Racism. There is a huge pool of opposition to racism. The weakness lay in the fact that what they didn't understand was the need to develop a very specific strategy to take on and to challenge Le Pen. But things are beginning to change. In the aftermath of the May elections, there was a massive demonstration, 10,000 plus people against the rise of Jean-Marie Le Pen, organised by the likes of the Front de Gauche, the new anti-capitalist party, and the youth wing of the Socialist Party. And there are currently discussions amongst those groups about a mobilisation to directly confront the Front National conference in Lyon next month. I'll finish by saying this, that a similar conference to the one that I attended 2 weeks ago was held in the autumn of last year, and it was out of that conference that the demonstrations on the 22nd of March took place in a number of countries and cities across Europe. A demonstration on UN Anti-Racism Day designed to bring together a whole number of people, trade unionists, workers, importantly as well, immigrant communities, some of which have not often felt confident to come out onto the street. Very important in terms of setting a marker down that we are going to build a movement to stand up to racism. At the end of the conference 2 weeks ago, the declaration was made for a similar mobilisation on the 21st of March next year. So that was something very important and concrete that came out of it. I just finish by saying that those things are important, but we know that they are not enough in and of themselves. What matters is that there is wider and broader struggle. I said, and I deliberately used the word, that the general trend from the European elections was to the right, but of course it wasn't exclusively so, was it? That in some parts of Europe, the shift was, the fragmentation was more to the left, to the right. In Greece itself, with the success of Syriza, in Spain, with the success of Podemos, the political collapse and crisis in Europe can shift both ways. And it's significant, of course, in those countries, areas where the crisis was often at its deepest, but also places where there were struggles, there were strikes, there were street demonstrations and so on, things that pulled people's politics to the left rather than to the right. Those things matter. It's important to build those things, but it's also important, if the circumstances in which the racists and the fascists have grown are circumstances of crisis, then we know the real antidote is building a movement that tackles the causes, the root causes of the crisis, which is why trying to build worker struggles, and as part of that, to carry those arguments, a revolutionary movement is of critical importance.
So we've
in Bristol actually taking sort of union organisation action to stop them doing that. So it's absolutely fantastic. There's a couple of points I wanted to make is, first of all, it's really important to see the difference between racism and fascism, and I think that is a mistake that did happen hitherto in France, and they are addressing that. Le Pen frighteningly came to power in the 80s and so on, and I was working out in the south of France at that time, and there was more and more BNP Le Pen headquarters taking up residence in different towns and cities at that time, on the failure of the Socialist Party to deliver to ordinary people, but also building up support amongst small businessmen and petty owners of workplaces and farms and so on. But they also had another, as well as the political field, had a very nasty bully boy tactic behind the scenes, and they were attacking. There was a communist, a left-wing cafe that we used to go along to. The bully boys would physically come along and smash the place up and things like that. They had a political force, and they had a bully boy tactic behind the scenes. And I think it's really important to note that the fight against that did concentrate on racism and not on fighting fascism specifically, and I think that's a really important lesson.
Thank you.
I've got a concrete sort of question really. In run up to the election, the NUT, we would have tried to organise, we had a very successful question time before, which we held in the town hall, and we had nearly 200 people turned out to it. It was really, really good. And we wanted one another one because the NUT has produced an education manifesto to put forward, which surprisingly the Labour Party and the Tory Party, neither of which will agree with. But so we put forward our education manifesto. So we'll have somebody like Kevin Courtney come up to put that forward. And we're going to invite prospective parliamentary candidates on the platform. So you can see my question. So my question is, I mean, obviously I completely support any other platform, no platforms are fascist, completely correct. But I think UKIP's different, because I think we need to take them on head on with the arguments and destroy them. But the question is, do we have them on the platform as a prospective parliamentary candidate, or do we not? I'd like some advice on that.
Yeah. Did you want to say something? Were you indicating or?
Me?
Yeah. No. Chrissy.
Okay. I'm Chrissy Gardner. I'm in Unite the Union with Gwyneth in the health branch in Bristol. I think we probably all know about the relationship between economic crisis and then the rise of racism, fascism. And I was recently reading a book called Fighting Back, which is about the 1930s sort of crash. And, I had heard a lot about that. I mean, everyone grew up with that, didn't they? It was so bad in the 30s. And I hadn't actually read anything about what happened during that time and how people fought back. And I found the book astonishing because it was the most amazing crisis, actually, wasn't it? And I'm sure Joseph will be able to give you much more facts on that economically. But there were cities in America at that time, like Chicago, with 70% unemployment. So it was absolutely devastating for people, ordinary people who were employed. And they would wait, people would wait for the garbage bins to come and dump the garbage, and then they would sift through the garbage and eat what they could. But the author of this book said no matter how hard it was for the white people of America, it was harder for black people. Now, I don't know how much harder it could be, actually. And our branch has a history of supporting anti-fascist work, anti-racism work. I'm proud to say that our branch was the first branch to sign up, union branch to sign up for We Are Bristol, that famous demonstration on the bridge that Selina was referring to earlier. So I think it's really important for us to come together and collectivise, like you've been saying. I think no matter whether you're in the trade union movement, thinking about being in the trade union movement, come to this Unite Resistance conference on the 15th of November. You'll meet people like ourselves. Our branch is sponsoring this. We're fighting for our lives at the moment over our health service, but we have a strong anti-Islamophobia, anti-racism policy within our branch. There'll be lots for you to hear about at this conference. So no matter where you are in the trade union movement, if you're unemployed, Heather was here a minute ago, you can be in Unite, you can be a community member. And incidentally, a lot of the strikes that took place in the 1930s fighting back were unemployed people. So come along to it. I'm signing people up today. Our health branch is sponsoring it and sending a coach. And we'll talk to you about it if you can't afford to come, but come along. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, on the question of hustings, I think I agree. We don't know platform UKIP, and we don't demonstrate if they are speaking of hustings and so on. And if they invite themselves, maybe you have to have them on. I don't think if you're organising a labour movement hustings, though, we need to invite UKIP. I think they're getting enough publicity as it is, given that they only have one MP and comparing them to the Green Party and so on. So personally, I wouldn't invite them to events such as that at this point in time. The point I want to make is a slightly different one, which is how do we identify fascism? And it's very important we go back to what the essence of fascism is. What we're talking about is people who aspire to build a street movement capable of mobilising people and at moments of capitalist crisis offering a way out to capitalists by smashing resistance, atomising the working class and imposing a dictatorship in the interest of capital. That's what in essence characterises the fascist movement. And it's what characterises not just the obviously fascist movements, but also things like the Front National in France. At the core of them, you have people who have that aspiration. It's very important to say that because you now have lots of organisations, as Brian said, which look like they're doing the same thing as the Front National, but don't have at the core those kind of politics. UKIP is a case in point. UKIP emerge out of a section of the British ruling class who are hostile to Europe and so on, who are prepared to use the same style of racist rhetoric to build up electoral support in order to carve out a niche within the existing parliamentary system. Farage's vision is not the establishment of a benign fascist dictatorship. He wants a place at the table of the British establishment and is prepared to use racism to get it. It's very important we draw that distinction. It has implications for how we fight them. Because in terms of fascism, you can talk about mobilising all those forces inside the working class, reformists or revolutionaries or what have you, who have an interest in preventing fascists coming to power. Labour Party, the unions and so on. You can create very broad coalitions on that basis. Around UKIP, it's more difficult. What's the real threat that UKIP pose? The real threat that UKIP pose, I think, is first of all, they shift the entire agenda of British politics to the right. They normalise racism and a right-wing populist rhetoric. Secondly, they can become a point at which fascist forces start creating a space or actually crystallise around in it takes different forms in different countries. Therefore, one of the implications of that is we can't just do what bits of the Labour Party and unions want to do at the moment, which is simply oppose Farage on the basis he's a Thatcherite. We can't duck the question of racism. So it means Stand Up to UKIP has to both oppose them on their economic and social policies, but it has to explicitly oppose their racism. It poses a challenge for us because it means the basis on which Stand Up to UKIP is constructed can sometimes be a bit narrower than Unite Against Fascism. Nonetheless, it's very important that, although we'll have to make all kinds of compromises with unions and so on to construct the coalition, we have to take a very hard principle line on the question of racism.
Yeah, well, I remember talking to my 10-year-old son who said, black is a racist word. I said, no, it's got to be contextualised. The word in itself is not racist. And about a day later, I heard an 18-year-old, 8 years difference to my son and this 18-year-old, contemplating if immigration was racist. They're talking about immigration was racist. So I was amazed in the space of 8 years someone could go from one point, I've been afraid to use words, to the idea you can talk about racism quite openly if you can debate whether or not immigration is racist. So it's how people are bombarded by these arguments in growing up. But at the same time, when we look at the fascists, because racists we can understand, we look at the fascists didn't always use racism. Racism is a useful tool in fascism, but largely it's, you've got to get rid of the opposition to put through racist policies. So I always like Hitler's favourite quote, which is, he said, if our opposition knew our weaknesses, it was to smash us at the beginning before we got going, i.e. defeat us now before we're big. That's straight from Hitler's mouth. As far as I'm concerned, we take him at his word. We have to confront them where they are, because their tactic is to defeat the left wing, is to delete debate, trade unions, is to make a culture of fear where the opposition cannot operate, which gives them the grounds to spread and move out and attack. Whilst there's an opposition, they cannot do that. So I think it's always proud to differentiate between racism, but also understand that fascism's methods is to defeat the opposition and then pursue the path of racism.
Just one of the things that struck me when the by-elections were, the one which UKIP won a seat and the other one when they ran Labour close. I think the one where they won the seat, people were expecting it in that setting, the standing MP. So I think there was, through the Labour movement, there was a very sharp intake of breath that came to the other one. This is a Labour seat, traditional Labour seat, I think for 30 years or whatever. This should, in a time of austerity with Tory coalition government, and they just scrape in. I mean, they're the alarm bell, because I think there has been quite a lot of people, not just signed up members of the Labour Party, but people who want to, see the Tories out. And I've come across it inside the movement and stuff, which is, I can't stand UKIP. I hate them. But they do damage the Tories, don't they? They're going to split the right vote, and this will allow the left to get in. And I've had it with a couple of Labour councillors who are councillors, but also PCS members, where I work, who articulate this, So I think that puts that into a real sharp focus. But nonetheless, the Labour leadership seem to slightly go, okay, what we have to do is pander to the right. We have to pander and stuff. I think Diane Abbott, to her credit, I think has come out against that. So I agree with Joseph that it's quite a tricky thing, isn't it, constructing that sort of coalition. Nonetheless, I think, we can be quite proud of it, because we had a very good stand to UKIP event not long ago, which drew in large amounts of people. People should know the Southwest TUC here has done a fantastic pamphlet of busting immigration myths. And anyone in the union, I got the head of Southwest TUC to our union branch to do a PowerPoint presentation. It was very, very sharp, and led to a very big debate in my union branch, because people need to be educated and so on and so forth. So that does have quite an impact, I think, and then try and what we do. The other thing I would say, though, is that I think one of the difficulties, it's a twin-track approach, trying to get the level of resistance generally up, over whatever it is, whether it's over the question of pay, or the question of housing women in East London, whatever it is, that is also going to damage. If we could raise the level of resistance, that will damage Farage. I know they're not the same as fascists, but I remember thinking over the time of Le Pen, one of the times when he's been really damaged, when there's been a big level of resistance, and there has been big level of strikes, he either hasn't got anything to say, or comes out against it, and slightly starts to look sort of slightly irrelevant. I mean, some high points, you've got nothing to say about this. People in the streets about paying pensions and education, whatever. And therefore, I think it's that total package, isn't it, about raising the level of resistance alongside a very, very hard anti-racist campaign. And I think we have to sit down in Bristol and think how we, when we know where they're going to stand, how are we going to tackle that, and that needs some serious thought.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say that I think we do have some copies of that pamphlet out there which people can just take if they want. There's there's as well as absolutely excellent, which we would try and take £2 off you for, SWP pamphlet, which goes through very important points. Quite a few people have indicated to speak. I do just want to say, if you only have something very small, if you don't speak in a meetings very often, do feel free, just try and catch my eye, indicate. It'd be great to hear what you think, what your experience is.
I think Joe talked about, building stand-ups gets quite important, and it can be quite narrow, but also as when Brian says trying to build an anti-racist campaign in general, has its problems because it's been quite weak. But the advantage of Stand Up to UKIP, it allows us to focus those anti-racist campaigns. It may be into a lot narrower than UAF. It allows us to focus them under kind of one umbrella in a way. And the Stand Up to UKIP event that we did in Bristol was part of trying to do that. The actual platform we had was a range of speakers trying to cover different aspects of racism in our society, but all in a funnel to try and bring it under weight of how we took on UKIP. Now, how successful that bears out in the long run is a different thing, but I thought, in a way, it was the start of a process. So that's the key thing that we're going to have to do around UKIP, is how we're continuously going to have to look for these different minorities and groups and pull them in and gain that confidence. In a way, the advantage of doing that is because we do have a timetable leading up to a general election, which enables us to do that with a set amount of things that we lead up to that as well. So that's something that in Bristol we have to really concentrate on. I was allowed into schools to speak to students about racism and fascism because I just applied and said, do you want to let me in? And they let me in. That was quite useful. We have to be quite imaginative about where we go these days, because I think there is a feeling out there that we have to take them on. And the danger is that how they are moving politics further to the right. Another bigot, when Paisley died, somebody rang me and asked me what Ian Paisley, when he died, what it was. And when I really thought about it, was Ian Paisley's greatest legacy is how he moved unionism to the right and further sectarian, where they made concessions in later life. He set unionism as a whole further to the right, further more bigoted, further more racist. That's his true legacy. That's what UKIP have the potential to do. They have the potential to move the centre ground of British politics further to the right, conservatism as a whole far further to the right as well, which in its dangers will lead to fascism able to probably build in a lot easier way than ever before. So these are the things that we do really have to think about in the next year. But there's a strength there. We just have to kind of go and find it.
John?
Yeah, no, one of the things that I think UKIP have really tried to push, and I think has had resonance among some people, is the notion that they're breaking the traditions of the establishment, that what we're seeing is a new aspect of democracy. And they're trying to feed into a general kind of criticism of what's happening in the world. But actually, I think the notion, and I think you was touching on this, is the degree to which, and Joe was, the degree to which this is a manoeuvring within the ruling class itself. They're not unique, quite the opposite. In fact, the real cable of UKIP, basically the old Tory party, who are very, very unhappy with the direction that the present leadership is. And so consequently, I think what we need to do is really to focus on the fact that A, they're not fascist, and I think we need to be very clear about that, but that doesn't stop them being very nasty, very vicious and very vindictive, and that they are that tradition that's come out. Well, it's interesting, we talked about Paisley. The big crime of Paisley was that he was one of the great parliamentarians. And I dare say that Nigel Farage would like to present himself as I'm not a fascist because I'm a great parliamentarian. What we need to do is say, no, you're not a fascist. But what you are doing is you're an anti-working class organisation that is trying to smash all the gains that we've made over the years, that the Labour movement has made in our society. And if we can focus on that and really argue that these are the same faces, very much wearing maybe a different camp, but essentially the same faces, I think we can make progress, and I think we do need to challenge them on that. And just to finish, I think also, if they are, which they are, trying to push the whole paradigm, if you like, of politics in this country further to the right, I think we need also to challenge the Labour Party. I think you was touching on it, you know, the need to absolutely nail the Labour Party, because the Labour Party leadership is so supine, so cowardly, so jelly-like, that they're following in every time that Farage makes a statement, Cameron makes the next one, and Eddie comes marching in and follows them. It's like a string of beads, and this is the point. So I think we can do that. I think we can cut against that. And I think we might get to start rebuilding on the left and start being able to challenge it, and that would be a kind of pole of attraction that's counters people like UKIP. We need to.
Well, I was selling papers yesterday at the university, and I think Richard was there, and there's two blokes come up. One of them said, oh yes, I'm going to sign that, but I am not a socialist. I don't want a socialist worker. I'm a member of the Conservative Party, but I don't like UKIP because of this, that and the other. Well, I ended up going for a coffee with him. And it was quite interesting talking to him because his friend was a Kurd in Turkey and they have different arguments. But the point is, he was definitely genuinely anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic, but he was genuinely a conservative. And at the end of this conversation, he shook my hand. He said, "It's fantastic to talk to somebody." He signed that petition. And the thing I'm thinking, what do we do? Because we've got a lot of signatures from a lot of people who are, you know, yes, I'll sign that on the statement. We had a good meeting. If the fascists could have stand at the Bristol Bridge, we know what to do. We mobilise people and confront them. Now, we've got a gap between now and the election. We can't be passive and wait till the election. But there's no absolute focus. We have to find focus to actually crystallise that and find people something to do. And I'm not sure what it is, because they aren't fascists. We don't do all those things. We don't. Things that Brian and other people talking about. We have to be very careful. We don't label them as fascists, but we've got to find something to mobilise that support and think about that. So just another little thing. Yesterday as well, there was a building work done last week. This bloke was moaning and groaning about taking stuff in for a delivery van, and he said, I'm poor because of the fucking Labour government and the pensions and I've got to work till I'm 68 and I'm voting UKIP. And there's no logic. But the danger is, and when we were doing the bedroom tax stuff, yeah, this is good. Or a bloke coming up to me and said, I'm son of a miner, everything's right, but I'm going to give UKIP a chance. People, we have to actually expose them for what they are, because there's to a lot of people, that's the alternative, because the others are so similar. At least this bloke's saying something, even though when they actually analyse it, it's really unpalatable to what they really believe. So we've got to expose it, but we have to find ways of mobilising people who actually want to do that.
Right, and there's two more people who've indicated to me. So because we'll be sort of got a few more minutes. Anybody want to say anything little? Do think of indicating. Nick.
Okay. Just to reinforce the argument, the need to confront UKIP and the racism as soon as possible and emphasise the racism part of it, because as Phil indicated, what their policies are, and if you analyse their policies, if and when they ever took power, I think we find out pretty soon how bad they are and how much worse than the Tories, but in a way that might be too late, because the whole point is that they will poison the atmosphere with the racism before that happens, and that has already happened in terms of how the Tory government is trying to rejig the rules on immigration within the EU, for example, and how Labour politicians are now saying, oh well, yes, but people have a right to be concerned about immigration, rather than tackling the fact that it is racism. It's the poisoning of the atmosphere that's happening in advance of any elections that's the dangerous bit. And actually, in other countries where UKIP-like parties have formed part of a coalition, people have eventually come to realise what they are like. And most of the Scandinavian countries, that's happened over the last 10 years, for example. Other point is about, going back to what Nigel Farage said about feeling like he was in a foreign country taking the train out of London. There was a survey a few years ago from the United Nations, which, however it was measured, London came out as the most multicultural place on the planet, which I think is something to be proud of. And it is noticeable that in the last Euro elections, the UKIP vote in London was considerably less than outside. So the idea that people are frightened, the electorate are frightened of being multiculturalism, we can demonstrate that is not the case.
Yeah, it follows on about UKIP. I mean, I think one of the key things, and I think it's just to pick up on what people said, what Phil say, it's about how we concretely address, and confront them in the run-up to the election. And I think really, one of the things I was going to say is, the magnificent pace I saw in the health service last week, that was the one day I didn't hear from fucking Nigel Farage on the radio. And actually, there's a point about that, isn't it? Because what have UKIP got to say to workers when there is a fight going on? Very little. What have they got to say about the health service? Well, we know they're against it. And actually, I thought Socialist Workers were really useful. You know, within there contain the arguments about actually the health service has been built on black and white people working together. Actually, and I think those are the sorts of things, being very concrete, is the sort of thing that we are going to be. That's a way in which we can do the things that Joseph's talked about, where confront on two things at the same time. Their racism and also the fact that actually they would dismantle everything if they got their way, which is useful to people, you know, to ordinary people. And I think those are the sorts of things that we need to be thinking about so that we can very concretely address the things that actually a vote for UKIP. It's not some radical alternative, actually it's cutting our own throats.
So I'll ask Brian to come back in a moment. Just before I do, I just want to say, as Vice Chair of Bristol Health Service Branch, I'm very proud that our union branch did help fund a coach to the Stand Up to UKIP demonstration, where we made a bit of noise at the start of UKIP's conference in Doncaster, and it was absolutely fantastic demonstration with a huge wide cross-section of people marching past a place which we knew was, I think something like 99% white and I don't know, 80% male or something. There were some precise figures, but it was of that sort of nature. People will see back out there, there are copies of this statement, which I think Phil referred to, which is the Stand Up to UKIP statement. It's more than just a petition, perhaps, in that people's names will be published. And if people want to take copies of that, maybe I'll sort of put myself forward as from the union branch, which will be looking at how we can take this further. Just let us know that you've done that. And of course, there's various publications, including the one that Brian has edited and contributed to himself, and the Stand Up to UKIP pamphlet mentioned. So, Brian, thanks.
Okay, I can be relatively brief because I think we've had a very good discussion, and I'm glad that I think it's rightly focused, quite specifically on UKIP and what we can, must, and should feel capable of achieving in terms of standing up to them. I think Joseph's right on the question of hustings, by the way. I mean, how much more exposure does Farage need? I mean, this guy has been on Question Time, unfortunately, edited by someone who used to be in the Socialist Workers' Party, for God's sake. This guy has been on Question Time more than any other politician over the last 5 years. You know, time after time after time, this guy has been on Question Time. I mean, he had a quiet period over the summer because not a great deal was happening, but before then, it's almost every day, every issue, you'd see Farage's face, froggy grin appearing on the TV. They do not, in a labour movement husting, it's absolutely unnecessary for us to be giving him yet another platform. But the broader point about not arguing for no platform in the way that we argue that fascists should have no platform is an important point. And in some ways it's worth reminding ourselves what no platform is about, because people do argue, that no platform is something that is anti-democratic and so on. Actually, it's profoundly democratic, because no platform is about workers' organisations, students' organisations and so on, having a debate and coming to the conclusion that we are not going to allow fascists whose raison d'etre is to smash all political opposition in order, as Joseph said, to provide an answer to capitalist crisis. They want to destroy democracy. They want to use democratic platforms in order to destroy democracy. That's why a democratic organisation debating and coming to a conclusion that we're not allowing fascist no platform is fantastically important, and is a democratic, something that comes from below rather than it being about censorship being imposed and arguing for the state to impose bans from above. But it's one thing to say we don't know platform, Farage and UKIP. It's quite another thing to say let's give them a platform. But in another very concrete sense, it should be the case that if they're holding public meetings, hustings and things like that, we should organise protests outside of those meetings and hustings. We should also get people to go going in and arguing, exposing the racism. That's precisely what people did at the first time when Farage came under heat, people might remember, was up in Edinburgh, wasn't it, in 2012. A fantastic little protest that put him on the back foot and on the defensive. And then the next major occasion was when they had the public meeting in central London in the spring of this year, where Farage felt obliged to put a couple of useful idiots, an Asian councillor and a couple of black women, front and centre to try and show that they're not a racist organisation. I think those kind of things back. I mean, the fact that I don't know if anyone saw Newsnight earlier in the week when Mike Reed's Calypso song had been and they put up an absolute clown called Winston McKenzie, a former boxer, to try and defend. Those kind of things. Exposing them to the glare of publicity in that sense, and exposing the lunacy, but also the rancid, anti-immigrant and anti-working class policies is important. So it is a different approach. It is about confronting them, taking them on, exposing their arguments in a way that is different to the way that we organise against fascists. But why bother inviting them to a labour movement? There's much more important things that can be done to mobilise working class people. I think it's right that what people have said about that we need to think about and be flexible. I'd be interested to know who paid for the coffee, by the way. You ordered. You ordered. I trust he.
You poor student, he told me.
But we'll need to think about different approaches to taking them on. Where they're not going to target every single constituency, I wouldn't imagine, and they don't know how many candidates they will put up. But clearly, Farage knows it's not that they're going to get dozens or hundreds of people elected to Parliament. They're going to, they believe that they could maybe win 6, 10, whatever seats, and they're going to really, really plough their resources into he needs to, they've made the breakthrough with Carswell. And on the point about this isn't an establishment party. Douglas Carswell, an absolutely establishment Tory. I think he had a role to play in drafting their last manifesto. And his criticism is that the Tories have betrayed that manifesto. The idea that this isn't some establishment, absolute nonsense. The guy who funded those rancid posters, a billionaire, Farage himself, the treasurer, Wheeler, public schools, stockbrokers, merchant bankers and so on. The idea that they're not part of the establishment is complete lunacy, and it is important to expose. It's important to expose all of those things, that absolutely they're part of the establishment, represent a wing of the establishment. Absolutely critically important, and the pamphlet does it, the anti-working class policies, what they would propose in terms of the destruction of the health service, the destruction of the school system, the massive cuts in public services that would devastate people's lives. Critically important that we expose those things, but also fundamentally important, unlike those people in the Labour Party, to nail them on the question of racism, because it absolutely is the case that the most toxic impact that they're having is dragging the centre of politics to the right. I mean, we spoke about it 18 months. The chapter that we have on racism and the far right in the book, this was published in June last year. That's precisely what we talked about, the impact post they didn't win, but they had a very significant electoral impact in the Eastleigh by-election in February of last year. We said then, if they're able to consolidate this, it will drag politics to the centre of politics to the right in Britain, and not standing up to that, on the basis, as you say, Hugh, that, we don't like them, they're horrible, but actually it's largely going to take votes away from the Tories. It's a rancidly unprincipled position. One thing that I slightly disagree with you on, John, is that it hasn't always been, I agree with most of what you say, hasn't always been the case that Cameron's been the first to jump in with the anti-immigrant sentiments. It's often been Miliband and Ed Balls and the Labour Party that have been first to jump in and spend their whole time apologising for the policies of the last Labour government, particularly unprincipled, from people like Miliband and Ed Balls, because these were, the key lieutenants of Gordon Brown. Brown, the Chancellor under the last Labour government and the Prime Minister, was the architect of their economic policy, not putting up borders to Eastern Europe, people from the accession countries. When the first, was it 8 countries from Eastern Europe joined the European Union, Brown didn't want to put up barriers preventing them coming in straight away. Why? Precisely because at that time he realised that the needs of the British economy were for more workers to come in, to build the Olympic Stadium and all of those places. So he didn't want barriers. Of course, a few years later, Prime Minister Gordon Brown, desperate to try and curry favour with voters, was talking about British jobs for British workers. So more than most people, Miliband and Balls know why Labour had the particular strategy on immigration that it had when it was in government. And yet now, desperate to curry favour with voters, they jump up and talk about how Labour got it wrong in immigration last time. Hideously unprincipled position. But it is the case. We did talk 18 months ago. We talked at our Marxism conference in July of 2013 about the need to set up a stand up to UKIP. And I'll be honest with you, we struggled to get it set up at that time, precisely because there were huge sections of the Labour Party and so on whose position was, no, this is just taking votes away from the Tories. They've had a huge wake-up call now, haven't they? That, I think you're right, Hugh, that people did expect them to win the Clacton by-election, and of course they didn't win in Middleton, but they massively, 600 and whatever votes it was that Labour won it by. It shows that they have been biting, they can bite hard into the supposedly traditional Labour vote. And it actually, therefore, is one thing that has made it, I think, more possible for us to talk to people about constructing stand up to UKIP. And we have to think very carefully how we do that. In some areas, where they're standing, or if they're standing nearby, is going to mean very specific mobilisations to challenge their hustings and so on. If other areas where they're not standing, there's still things that can be done, making sure that people take the statements round their work, take the statement round your workplace, get people to pledge their support for it. Get your union branches, your student unions and so on to affiliate, to stand up to UKIP, give money, resources, encourage people to get involved in the activity, have a public meeting, get people involved in any local activities. There's a whole number of different things that can and should be done. But of course, ultimately we do have to come back to the wider question of how we build a political alternative, because of course, it's not just that, Farage doesn't have anything to say about the strikes. Well, he does have something to say about unions, doesn't he? He talks about there's absolutely no way we want to go back to the bad old days of the 70s when the society was in hock to trade union barons. Absolutely anti-working class and anti-trade unions. Complete hostility to trade unions. But we know You look at those picket lines, the nurses, the picket lines, the NHS picket lines on Monday of last week. Black, white, Asian, Filipino, the people from every corner of the world fighting to defend the health service, fighting for decent pay, and so on. Building those struggles, uniting people, in something positive is ultimately the antidote, isn't it? So it's a combination of the specific initiatives where UKIP are mobilising, continuing to build and get affiliations to unite against fascism, recognise, if after the May elections, who knows what government we're going to get. We get a Labour government that is attacking working class people as it is promising to do. That will provide further fertile ground for the fascists to grow. So it's important that we continue to support and get affiliations to unite against fascism. Building the demonstration in March of next year. Everyone who signs the statement is someone we can have a broader discussion with about fighting racism. Can be involved in the softer cultural things. Love music, hate racism. Can be someone who comes on the demonstration in March of next year. A whole number of specific anti-racist and anti-fascist things that can be done, but also building that broader struggle that unites our class in a struggle against the what ultimately causes the poison in the first place.